All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian podcast. My guest today is Dr. Jennifer Houston McNeel. Dr. McNeel has a PhD in New Testament and is a core faculty member at St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. She is the author of the brand new book, Under Her Wings, Mothers and Motherhood in the New Testament, where she explores the role mothers and maternal imagery play in shaping New Testament text. We'll be discussing this book on our show today. Dr. McNeel, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you about the book. Like I was saying before the show, this is a very unique work of biblical scholarship. And it's one of those issues that when someone points out to you how pervasive it is in the New Testament, you can't unnotice it after that. But I really didn't appreciate the extent to which maternal imagery shaped a lot of aspects of New Testament theology. So I'm really excited to talk to you about the book. But before we get into that, introduce yourself to my audience. So, what do you do, your background, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. As you said in the intro, I teach New Testament at St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute. So this school is part of St. Mary's Seminary and University, which is the oldest Roman Catholic seminary in the United States. But I teach specifically in the Ecumenical Institute division. So I teach students that come from both Catholic as well as all kinds of Protestant denominations, just about everything you can think of, we get there. So that makes for a really great learning environment, lots of diversity, lots of rich discussion. And my own background, so I grew up Lutheran. I attended a Lutheran seminary in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Got a Master of Divinity degree there, although I was never actually ordained as a pastor. Went on to get a PhD at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. My work focuses most on the women of the New Testament, but I also have had a lot of interest in Paul's letters in general, and also in the metaphors of the Bible, how the metaphors work in the Bible. So that's basically it.
I think that when I was in Bible college, and this would have been like 15 years ago or so, I remember, I think it was Abraham Malherbe. You might be able to fact check me on this, but I read an article that was called something like Our Mother Paul or something along those lines. And it was a very short article, but it just talked about how in certain texts in Paul, he used maternal imagery. And I remember reading that article and being like, well, that's interesting. And I haven't really thought about it much since then. But then when I read your book, I realized, like I said, that this is kind of a huge theme. And so as you're developing this book, you obviously you're working with other secondary sources, and so people have written on this subject before, but I don't know of any book quite like this. So what motivated you to write Under Her Wings, and were there any challenges in producing a book that is kind of breaking some new ground?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned Paul's maternal metaphors, because that's actually sort of my own origin story with the book, is that I discovered those images back a couple decades ago when I was at the Lutheran seminary in Gettysburg. And, I had read the New Testament before going to seminary, but somehow I had always, read right past those. It's the kind of little things where if you're not looking out for them, you might just quickly skim past them and not really notice. But of course, going to school for studying the Bible, you have to slow way down. So
Right.
Especially even there, I had to read the New Testament in Greek even. And that really makes you slow down. And so, I encountered those images there. The first one that I encountered was I was writing a paper on 1 Thessalonians, and the image of Paul as a nursing mother in chapter 2 really caught my attention there. And from there, I discovered that wasn't the only time Paul called himself a mother, which I just thought was fascinating because, first of all, you don't really expect a man in the ancient world to call him, use maternal imagery for himself, or even the modern world, really, but especially the ancient world in terms of, these gender norms and honor shame culture and things like that. So the fact that he did that was just very intriguing to me. So I actually went on to write my PhD dissertation on the image from 1 Thessalonians. And after that, I think there's a lot of other stuff going on with motherhood in the New Testament as well, not just these images in Paul. And, I wrote a dissertation on 1 Thessalonians, but there's not a lot of people in this world that want to read 200 pages on one verse of the New Testament. So maybe it would be interesting to really broaden out the scope of that and see what's going on in the whole New Testament about motherhood. And that might be something people would be interested in. So that's kind of how it came about.
Well, no, I really appreciate that summary. And the thing that when and this is this very biblical scholar thing to do. But before we actually get into the texts themselves, in your book you talk about both the way that the writers of the Old Testament thought about motherhood, and also kind of the Greco-Roman conception of motherhood as well. And so I want to go through both of those because it is really important to understand the historical context before you start analyzing these individual texts. And we are going to go through pretty much everything in the New Testament today. So let's start with the Old Testament. How did the writers of the Old Testament understand motherhood, and what are some very famous instances of the use of maternal imagery in the Old Testament?
Hmm. I think one of the ways that motherhood really plays into the Old Testament, especially the earlier narratives like Genesis narratives and things like that, is simply in the importance of family to the Old Testament story. So, um, what I say in the book, Abraham wasn't called to be a priest or a king; he was called to be a father. Right? That's really significant, I think. And the people of God, as conceived in the Old Testament, grow both in the sense of growing in numbers, but also perpetuating through the generations by having babies. And of course, you can't have babies without mothers. So
Right.
even though the Old Testament narrative really is quite patriarchal overall, because of this importance of family and of having children. In the midst of this patriarchal narrative, we get these stories of Sarah and Rebecca and Hannah and others that just pop up in some really significant ways. So that's one important way. Um, Also, with that, we have this theme of barrenness that is running through all of those stories. I think a couple of things are going on there. One is simply because of the importance of the women being mothers that I've already mentioned. It's a great concern to them, that they feel social shame if they are not producing children. So that plays into that barrenness motif. Also, we have the idea that in the Old Testament that God is the one who controls the womb, right? So it's up to God whether these women have babies or not, and that we see that kind of playing out over and over again throughout there. Um, and then that's kind of the Genesis narratives. We also have then, when you get into the more metaphorical motherhood realm, we have a lot of that in the prophets. God is compared to a compassionate mother in Isaiah, for example. God's even portrayed as you sort of giving birth, experiencing birth pangs and things of that nature in the prophets. So some of those images pop up there a lot as well.
And I want to talk about the Greco-Roman context. It's actually really funny that we're having this conversation today because about 3 days ago, I was having a conversation with one of my coworkers just about the way that people in history think differently than we do. And so it's easy to assume, okay, like, so you read like some of the household codes in the New Testament, and people realize, okay, things were a little bit different back then. But for the most part, we just kind of assume that the Greco-Roman world thought about things like motherhood in the exact same way, the exact same way that we do today. But that's not really the case at all. And so, especially for someone like Paul, who's traveling around the Mediterranean world and interacting with people that had a very different set of expectations about motherhood than we do, what was kind of the way that the Greco-Roman world understood motherhood and things that were related to that?
hmm The first thing I would say, I think, is just the importance of motherhood for women. Not that it was, not that motherhood was focused on pervasively in society as a whole, but more the idea that motherhood is kind of, I hate to say it this way, but it's kind of true. The point of women,
Right. Yeah.
like the reason that women exist, is so that men can marry them and have legitimate offspring. That's sort of the purpose that women serve. If you want to talk about sort of the more extreme forms of patriarchal culture, and so I talked about that a little bit already in the Old Testament background, the shame that women felt if they couldn't have children. It's a little different in the Greco-Roman world, but still that importance, I think, of women getting married and having children is there in the broader Greco-Roman world as well. So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind, and that relates to. I think that's related to the idea of women getting married earlier in the ancient world than is typical today, at least in many parts of the world today, because As I said, it was kind of their, thought of as their main
Right.
purpose for existing. So once a girl has gone through puberty, they didn't wait as long
Right. Right.
to marry her off, as we might think of doing today. um, Another thing I think that's important is in terms of differences today, is thinking about the legal aspects of parenthood, and that fatherhood was actually imbued with a lot of legal power. In the ancient world, fathers had power over their children, in a legal sense, and mothers really didn't. So, for example, when divorce happened in the ancient world, the children would typically stay with the father, right? Because he sort of belongs to them,
Right.
not to the mother. So that's a little bit of a different mindset, I think, than we've typically had maybe in recent history, in the United States and other similar places. On the other hand, mothers were thought of, or recognized as having a lot of influence over their children. So they didn't have a lot of legal power over their children, but everybody knew that mothers influenced their children, in many and various ways. So that was definitely the case in the Old Testament, or in the ancient world as well.
Yeah, that is a really helpful framing, and it's funny that you start with the Gospels, and we're going to start with the Gospel of Matthew and his birth narratives, because women and mothers in particular play a very prominent role in the birth narratives. It is so easy for Christians to overlook those stories because we just associate them with Christmas. It's like you read the first two chapters of Matthew and the first two chapters of Luke, and it's like, oh, that's what we do during Christmas season, and we almost kind of miss the theological value of those texts, and we almost forget that there's a lot of other stuff going on other than the play that our kids are in on Christmas Eve. So let's start with the Gospel of Matthew. There are several mothers in that story. So what do we learn from the opening chapters of the Gospel of Matthew about motherhood in the New Testament?
Yeah, so I think probably if you ask most people who's the first mother mentioned in the New Testament, they would say Mary, but actually that's not correct. The first mother mentioned in the New Testament, in our canonical ordering of the books, is Tamar, from Genesis 38, who appears in the genealogy of Jesus that Matthew gives. So that's really fascinating, right? So why are we having Tamar here, right up front? And then, of course, within that genealogy, he also mentions Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, although he calls her the wife of Uriah, doesn't use her name. But, you know, over the years, everybody has debated about this. Why are these women here? Because it's only those four. The rest of the genealogy is a very traditional father son genealogy, much like many of the genealogies that we are familiar with from the Old Testament. They go father son. And this one does as well, except these four women are put in. So, what are they doing there? And why these four? Because if we just wanted to include the ladies, right, to be nice, we might think that he would have put in Sarah. We might think that he might have put in Rebecca, right? But it's not the big matriarchs. It's these other four. So, there's been a lot of different proposals and ideas over the years about this. What I propose in the book is that I think these women are there because all four of them had very unconventional paths to motherhood. And that in particular, I think, prepares the reader to hear the story of Mary and Joseph that is just about to be told, which is, of course, a very unconventional birth story,
Right.
in terms of the virgin birth and the way that plays out. So that's my own argument. I think that's what they're doing there. So others think it's more about them being Gentiles, or other things have been proposed over the years, but that's the argument that I make in the book about that. And really the theological point of that then is basically that God was at work in these unusual stories in the Old Testament, and so we are ready now to understand that God is at work in these events, related to the birth of Jesus.
Yeah, and it's easy for us to because we've kind of glossed over the birth narratives, like in children's pageants, which is when Americans think about the birth narratives, that's their framing for that. It is a combination of Matthew and Luke, and there's kind of this almost like this synoptic gloss between the two, that they're weaving certain parts of Matthew and Luke into, but they're actually very distinct stories. And one of the interesting dynamics there is that in the Gospel of Matthew really focuses on Joseph. Joseph is in some ways like the main character, but then when you get to the Gospel of Luke, Mary and Elizabeth are like the two main characters of the birth narrative in there. And so you address this in your book. So why are Mary and Elizabeth so significant in the Gospel of Luke, and what is what's the theological takeaway for their heavy presence in that text for us, and what can we learn about motherhood from their presence in Luke?
Well, in terms of Elizabeth in particular, I think one of the reasons she plays a central role in Luke is because Luke is really at pains in the opening chapters to connect the story of Jesus to the story of Israel. So when the story opens, we're introduced to a barren woman. So we've already talked about barrenness from the Old Testament. We're introduced to a barren woman who's past childbearing age, and her husband is given a promise that they are going to have a baby. So if you are familiar with the Old Testament, some bells are going to be going off here, right? We've kind of heard this story before. This is the story of Abraham and Sarah, right? So there's this strong parallel being drawn between Elizabeth and Sarah. So to me, that communicates what Luke is trying to communicate there, is that this story of Jesus that's about to unfold is directly related to not just the Old Testament in general, but even the promise to Abraham, that the whole world would be blessed through his offspring and through Sarah's offspring, right? So we're going to see the unfolding of that promise playing out in the story of Jesus and the gospel message that comes from that. So that's kind of how I see Elizabeth there. And then, of course, as you said, she's really deeply connected in the story to Mary, who also plays, of course, a very important role. Mary's role extends longer. Elizabeth appears only in chapter 1. Mary's story then continues also through chapter 2 as well. So there we have the famous story that we tend to call the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel comes to her and says that she's going to bear Jesus. And so I think one of the, lots of things are going on in Luke chapter 2, but one of them is this theme of connection, which is one of the themes related to motherhood that I trace throughout the whole book, not just this chapter. But Mary and Elizabeth are connected to one another, but also Jesus and Mary are connected to one another very intimately in the second chapter. I'm indebted to the scholar Jamie Clark Souls for this insight, but in the Annunciation story, Gabriel says that God's Spirit will overshadow Mary. And that overshadowing word also appears in the Transfiguration story, where the presence of God overshadows Jesus. And that's the only 2 times we have that sense of the Spirit or God or the Spirit overshadowing someone in the text. So it's this real strong connection between Jesus and Mary there. And so that's one of the ways that the New Testament uses motherhood. It is to establish connections between individuals or between groups, because of the idea that many of us have, that mothers and children are deeply bonded to one another.
Yeah. And I think you do bring this up in your book, but I also have found that and that's the story of John the Baptist's parents. It's very similar to the story in 1 Samuel about Samuel's parents as well. Like you were talking about how bells should go off when you hear that story. And I want to get your thoughts on that. Do you think that there's kind of like a Christological move being made? It's almost like, in the same way that Samuel was kind of like the prophet that anointed David, John the Baptist is the prophet that anointed Jesus. Do you think that there's something at play in that comparison between Elizabeth and the parents of Samuel as well?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think the comparison happens actually there with Elizabeth, but also with Mary, because the well, we call it her song, although the text says she spoke it.
Yeah.
But what we call the Magnificat, Mary's speech or song, it has deep echoes of Hannah's prayer. from First Samuel. So I think there, I think that's a good idea that you have about the connection between Samuel sort of preparing the way for David and John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. But also we have then in the second chapter, well, no, that's still the first chapter. Just also we have the connection being made between Samuel and Jesus as well, because their mothers are being connected. Hannah and Mary are being connected. So I think we're supposed to ponder some kind of connections between Samuel and Jesus as well. And I think that probably has something to do with Jesus being portrayed as a prophet by Luke a little bit more. So like Luke leans into the idea of Jesus as a prophet a little bit more than some of the other gospels do, right? And so we have this connection to Samuel as a great prophet. And also that Davidic connection, is there as well. Samuel is the one who anoints David. And then Luke says, even in these early chapters, Luke says, this is the son of David, being born, and he's going to fulfill this promise of the Davidic kingdom.
Yeah, no, and I just love the way that Luke uses that imagery. One of the really interesting dynamics about the Synoptic Gospels is that Mary, well, at least in Matthew and Luke, Mary plays a very prominent role in the beginning of the narrative, and she is somewhat of a recurring character, but she's not extremely active during Jesus's ministry. But you have a whole chapter in your book, or a section of a chapter in your book, on the Gospel of John, and Mary plays a much more active role in Jesus's ministry. And John, I mean, like in John chapter 2, she has a speaking role in Cana, right? So she's a much more prominent character in that story. So talk to us about John's gospel and the role that Mary plays within that gospel, and kind of how that works, just having Jesus's mother, reappearing at various places throughout his ministry in John.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would want to be careful not to emphasize the importance of her role too much, because she doesn't actually appear anywhere between chapter 2 at the Cana story and chapter 19 at the cross. So she doesn't really sort of recur as a character throughout John's main narrative. That being said, where does she show up? She shows up at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, and she shows up at the cross. I mean, those are two pretty important places, right?
Yes.
So I do think she's important. I just wouldn't want to sort of give the impression that she sort of plays a prominent role throughout the whole narrative. But at the beginning, she really, I mean, I think the catalyst is really the best word that I've been able to come up with for what the role Mary serves in the Cana story. Jesus appears to be reluctant to begin his ministry. He says, "My hour has not yet come," and she really pushes him, to take action in the story, and then he does, right? He resists it at first, but he doesn't continue resisting it, and so she is really, the catalyst or the impetus for him to really begin this ministry that, of course, he's been called to begin, which is very important. At the end of the story, it says that she travels with him and her other children as well to the next place that he went. So we have this tiny little hint that she sort of continues on with him where he's going next. But then she's not actually mentioned again, as I said, until chapter 19, where she does appear at the foot of the cross with a couple of other women, as well as the beloved disciple. And that's, of course, a pretty important moment in the gospel as well. And I think we see Mary's motherhood there in the sense of her staying with him, right? Not abandoning him, but being there even at the most bitter hour, of his life. So.
Yeah. Well, it is very powerful. And one of the, again, it's just kind of another one of those really interesting things about the New Testament. So in Galatians chapter 4, Paul has a very passing reference to Mary. Doesn't claim her by name. He just says that Jesus was born of a woman, which is more than we get in any of the other Pauline letters. But I happen to be, and you're kind of the perfect person to answer this question, because you teach at an ecumenical institute. So you're with Christians from a lot of different traditions. And where I live in Northern Kentucky, we have a very heavily Catholic population. I was born and baptized Catholic, and I have a lot of friends and family members that I love. And I have one friend in particular that we very friendly and fun, but we kind of debate the Mary issue back and forth. He's Catholic, and so we kind of debate the Mary issue back and forth. One of the things that I've learned from my Catholic friends is that Protestants do kind of undervalue Mary. And I think your book does a really great job of showing just how important she is in the narrative of the Gospels. Like she is a very significant figure, and we should not underplay that. And so I want to ask you just about the legacy of Mary, because she does play such a prominent role in Roman Catholic theology. How should we as modern Christians think about her and her legacy in the New Testament? And what can we learn from her role as Jesus's mother in the New Testament?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that Protestants have undervalued her. I think that's beginning to change. I feel like I've heard a little bit more about her in recent years than maybe when I was a kid. So I hope that's beginning to change. But certainly, there's still a lot more, a lot more change that could be brought to that. Um, People have different ideas about what the goals of ecumenical dialogue are. I don't personally think that we have to come to a point where we agree about everything.
I totally agree
So
with you. Yeah.
I think that Protestants have a lot to learn from Catholics about Mary, but that doesn't mean that Protestants have to sort of take on board all of the Marian doctrines of the Catholic Church. Nor does it mean that we have to convince Catholics that they should not subscribe to those Marian doctrines. Like, they can keep subscribing to them and we can keep not subscribing to them. But nevertheless, we can remain in dialogue. And there's a lot to learn, I think, in having that dialogue. If we just think about, if I were to try to convince a Protestant to, think about the importance of Mary, I think I would mention a few things. First of all, we talk about Jesus as being the Word made flesh, right? That's his identity according to the Gospel of John. Well, how is the Word made flesh in Mary's body, right? I mean, I think that right there is enough to, without anything else, to say she's worthy of some reflection, in terms of what her role is in the story of Jesus and in our faith. Beyond that, she's portrayed, as we've already begun to talk about, very positively by the gospel authors, especially Luke, but the others as well. But I argue in the book that she's portrayed by Luke as sort of a model disciple, and even as a prophet. He doesn't apply the word prophet to her. That's my interpretation. But she has some aspects of her story that echo prophetic call stories from the Old Testament, and then she gives the speech, right, the Magnificat, which I interpret as prophetic speech. So that's pretty significant. We've already talked about her as a catalyst for Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of John. One thing I didn't really talk much about when we were talking about John was what happens at the cross. We talked about her being at the cross, but we didn't talk about the little dialogue where Jesus says to her to look at the beloved disciple, here is your son, and to the beloved disciple he says, here is your mother. So I go through a couple interpretations of what that could really mean in my book, but what I really argue for is that it is essentially the birthing of the church community at the cross. I think it's less about provision for Mary's needs, as is sometimes interpreted to be, and more about this creation of community between the mother and the beloved disciple. Neither of whom is named, and I think that's significant. We call the mother Mary because we know that's her name from other places. Church tradition has traditionally identified the beloved disciple as John, son of Zebedee, which is fine. I mean, I don't object to him being John. He can be John, she can be Mary, but I think there's a reason that the Gospel of John doesn't call either one of them by their name. And I think it has to do with them serving as symbolic figures for us of the beginning of the church community at that moment. So if we view that story in that way, again, that's just another way that Mary plays a deeply significant role in the story of our faith, and something that Protestants should maybe pay a little bit more attention to.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Well, I have one more question on the Gospels, and we focus so far on the mothers that people know from the Gospels, but you have a section in your book on how motherhood and some just like specific mothers are portrayed in a good light, and how some of them are portrayed in a bad light as well. And so I wanted you to give us some highlights of that. Like, what are some other areas outside of kind of like the birth and death of Jesus where mothers are portrayed in the Gospels positively, and then what are some ways where we can see the gospel writers using mothers as like a negative foil, or kind of portraying them in a negative light?
Mm-hmm. So one story that it's such a short story, but very intriguing, is the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. So who is obviously a mother because she's the
Right.
mother of
Right.
Peter's wife. And it's a very short story. But one of the detail in that story that people usually latch on to is the fact that as soon as she is healed, she gets up and begins to serve them. Now, sometimes this is interpreted as sort of kind of as a sexist story, right? Like
Right.
this poor woman has been in bed with a fever, but the second she's better, she had better serve a meal to the men
Right.
in the house. And you can look at it that way. I'm not really saying that's wrong, but there's always another way to look at everything as well, which is the fact that service is what Jesus calls people to, consistently throughout his ministry. And there's actually not that many of the disciples that we see serving anywhere, and Jesus tells them to be servants, right? But we don't actually observe them serving. So here we have this mother who receives healing by Jesus, and her response to being healed by Jesus is to serve others. So in that sense, I think she can be viewed as a disciple, right? As someone who is living out the calling that Jesus is proclaiming. I think probably my favorite one to talk about, though, is the Syrophoenician woman, or the Canaanite woman, as she's called in Matthew. Uh, this is this story is much talked about, particularly because of Jesus's character in the story,
Yeah.
and it bothers people, right? And so people tend to argue about what it means, or try to get Jesus off the hook in various ways for his interaction with this woman. But he's in Gentile territory. This is a Gentile woman. She's seeking help for her daughter, who is being possessed by a demon. And Jesus at first says that he won't help her. In Matthew, actually explicitly says why. He says, because I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So strongly implying that he's not going to help her because she's a Gentile. But she is very persistent. She just keeps coming back. She won't give up. So then finally Jesus says, it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs.
Yeah.
And so implying that the Jews are the children at the table, right? And the Gentiles are the dogs under the table. And as I said, people have tried to get Jesus off the hook for this statement in various ways throughout the years. But the truth is that nobody has ever liked being called a dog. I mean, we all love dogs, right? But we don't want to be called one. It was insulting in the ancient world. It's still insulting today. And yet we see the woman is still not done, right? Even when receiving that statement from Jesus, she sort of cleverly turns it around and says that even the dogs under the table get the children's crumbs, which is an ambiguous statement in which she doesn't reject the image that Jesus has presented her with, but also is not giving up still. Like, she's like, yeah, okay, whatever you say, but still, this is what I'm asking you for. And I believe that you have the power to give it to me. And I believe that the way that I interpret the story, of course, who knows what was in the woman's mind,
Right.
but the way that I interpret it is that her statement is basically saying, well, okay, but there's enough bread for everyone, right? And that statement seems to have a deep impact on Jesus. He heals her daughter. And then even we see him moving into Gentile areas more and doing ministry among crowds that are probably Gentiles after that. So it seems to have had really a profound effect on even the direction of his ministry, which is a pretty amazing story, I think. And it's a story about reaching across human-made dividing
Yeah.
lines. And I do feel like that's the story that we ought to be talking about today. Everybody today talks about how divided we are right
Yeah.
now. And here's a story where people who were on opposite sides of a dividing line reached out to each other. And there was maybe a few bumps in the road,
Right.
as there always will be. But nevertheless, they were both willing to reach out across that dividing line and keep persisting until they came to an understanding. And I think that's just a marvelous story for us to all
Yeah.
be talking about today. But when we try to get Jesus off the hook for what happens in the story, I think we actually lose that lesson that we could get from the story. And it becomes just a case of Jesus testing someone or Jesus trying to teach his disciples a lesson. And we really lose the heart of that message of the story that I think could be so helpful for us.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. Well, when you get to the book of Acts, obviously we are introduced to a number of interesting people in the book of Acts, but there are a few mothers in there as well. So what do we get about motherhood out of the book of Acts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer to your question is not a lot because,
Yeah.
and that's why it's such a short chapter in my book.
Yes.
And this really gets us into, the second half of the New Testament, where for many different books in Paul's letters, well, I say the second half of the New Testament, but really it's the whole thing, actually,
Yeah.
because this is in the Gospels as well. A sort of a sidelining of the importance of biological family. And so we have, even in the Gospels, Jesus making statements that indicate that the family of faith has a more prominent place than the biological family. Now, the family of faith can include biological family, right? They're not excluded. But this church community is sort of built on a community of faith, not on biological family. And so I think in Acts, as well as in the letters, we kind of see that playing out with women, because where we would expect motherhood to be greatly focused on, based on what I said earlier about how important it was for women in the ancient world to be mothers, nevertheless, when we come to Acts as well as Paul's letters, we see women really just more as women, not and their motherhood is not focused on. So there's quite a few interesting stories of women in the book of Acts. Are they mothers? We don't know, and that's okay,
Yeah.
except for it wasn't useful for me writing this
Right.
particular book. But in general, that's okay, right? That we don't know if they're
Yeah.
mothers or not. I think they probably were, because most women in the ancient world were mothers. But Acts doesn't tell us in most cases. So we don't know if Tabitha was a mother. We don't know if Priscilla was a mother. We do have just a few small cases where mothers can be identified. Mary is one at the very beginning. She's present with the other followers of Jesus after the resurrection. And so in that way, it's similar to what we talked about earlier, that Mary doesn't in any way play a significant ongoing role in the book of Acts, but nevertheless, she's there at a very crucial point at the beginning, right? So it's similar to the Gospels in that way. And then we just have someone who is hosting a church gathering in her house, the mother of John Mark. Her name is also Mary, by the way. And then the mother of Timothy is mentioned, but these are just very brief pieces.
Yeah. Well, when we get to Paul, I have two separate questions about Paul. At first, I want to ask just about where like, are there any places in Paul's letters where mothers appear in particular? Which, I mean, we obviously know that there are. So I guess I should reframe the question: where in Paul's letters do mothers appear, and what do we learn from the ways that Paul appeals to motherhood in his letters?
There's a couple. So there's a parallel to what I just said about Acts, in terms of Paul mentions female coworkers a few different times in his letters, but we don't know if they're mothers. So it's kind of similar to the book of Acts in that way. And of course, Paul is usually addressing the community as a whole, right? Not so much giving advice to the fathers and then to the mothers and then to the children. So maybe we wouldn't expect to find too much. I would say there's a few ways that mothers do appear in Paul's letters, though. One is he mentions a few Old Testament mothers. He mentions Eve, Sarah, Hagar, and Rebecca. I think that's the complete list. And I mean, if people are interested, they can read about that in the book, but they're not probably not significant enough for me to spend a lot of time talking about them right here. And then, like the book of Acts, there's a few places where real mothers are mentioned just very briefly. So he greets a man named Rufus and says that his mother was like a mother to him also. There's a stepmother mentioned because there's a sexual scandal involving a man living with his stepmother. And then Paul's own mother, because he says that God has, had this plan for him from the time that he was in his mother's womb. So he doesn't really talk about her in any way, but she's just sort of peripherally mentioned there. And I think this has to do, again, with the sort of lack of importance placed in the New Testament on biological family. So Paul's really focusing on women more as women, and not so much as mothers. But of course, when we get into the realm of metaphor, that's where we really have something. So I didn't know do you want to talk about that as well?
I was going to say, I mean, and this is one of the things I think you do a really great job of outlining in your book. Paul does use maternal imagery in several places in his letters, and so I want you to talk about that, because it is really, especially given the fact, like you said towards the beginning of the show, when we were talking about the Greco-Roman background, Paul lived in a patriarchal society, and so whether we like it or not, that was just the way that people, like the men had the power in that society, and that was just the way that it was. So his very use of maternal imagery historically is a curiosity, and he uses it in some very interesting ways. So talk to us about the way that Paul uses that maternal imagery in his letters.
He uses both birth imagery and breastfeeding imagery as well. Sometimes he uses it in a broad sense, and sometimes he applies it to himself. So it appears in quite a few different ways. In First Thessalonians, I had already mentioned the breastfeeding image there, that sparked my interest in this whole project. And there, essentially, Paul says that he was like a nursing mother to the community. So it's a warm, intimate image. He's trying to build his relationship with them, right? I talked earlier about the importance of connection for motherhood. Motherhood's associated with connection. So I think when Paul wants to strengthen the connection that he has with the Thessalonians, a maternal image feels like an appropriate one for him to choose to use to do that. In the same letter, we have a birth imagery, which is more of a conventional image that sort of draws on Old Testament and other Jewish literature that associates birth pangs with the end times. He says, when there's peace and security, sudden destruction will come upon them like birth pangs upon a laboring woman. And so I think Paul's kind of conventional there. He's not really innovating in that image. He's drawing an image of birth pangs that is used in the Old Testament and elsewhere. However, in Romans chapter 8, he is a little more innovative and creative with that birth metaphor. There's where we have the image of all creation being in labor pains together, and us being also experiencing these labor pains with all creation, as we're all sort of awaiting God's redemption together. So it's really an image of solidarity, and this idea of new creation. Paul uses the language of birth to express the idea of new creation, something new coming into being, right? And then I think there's another nursing image as well in First Corinthians, which is a little less tender and intimate and a little bit more reprimanding of the Corinthians. He says, I had to feed you with milk because you are not yet ready for solid food. So again, Paul is the mother of the community, this time not so much emphasizing his affection for them, but his sort of knowledge and authority to know what's best for them and to sort of, parent them in that way.
Yeah. So moving on from Paul, I want to look at Hebrews and the general epistles, and then we'll get to the book of Revelation, because that one's challenging. But so where do we see mothers or maternal imagery in Hebrews and then the general epistles towards the end of the New Testament?
Yeah, so there's two major ways that it appears in Hebrews and the general epistles, a metaphorical way and then the Old Testament mothers. So metaphorically, we have, again, birth imagery used by James and First Peter and First John. So the community is talked about as being born of God or being children of God. But particularly with the language of birth, not the language of begetting, but God has birthed us, or God has given birth to us. This is really an identity shaping strategy, I think, on the part of the authors. They want these communities to think of themselves as the children of God, and to live out the implications of what that means, even in the midst of persecution and struggle, right? So they need to be strengthened in what they're experiencing. And so to be born of God means you have a particular identity, right? Which gives you strength, and also an associated set of values or ideals to live out in your life. And then also in this part of the Bible, we have some Old Testament mothers mentioned, especially Hebrews 11, the famous sort of litany of faith. By faith, Abraham did this, and by faith, others did that. So we have, it's mostly men in that list. If you read through it, it's largely the male heroes of the Old Testament. But there are a few women are mentioned in that section, and actually all of them can be identified as mothers. So we have Sarah. The faith of Sarah mentioned. Also, interestingly, Moses's mothers, the biological and adoptive, are mentioned in there, which is something that doesn't get a lot of attention, I think, who Moses's mothers were and how that might have had an effect on who he became. But, he has this faithful Hebrew mother who nurses him and raises him when he's very small. But then I think it would be interesting for people to reflect a little bit more on the role of Pharaoh's daughter, who adopts him. I think obviously the Egyptians are the quote unquote bad guys in the story. And that's just, I think, how people are accustomed to thinking about that. But if you stop and think about it, she's kind of a remarkable figure. Her father has decreed that all these male Hebrew infants are to be killed. And I think we can assume that she would have known that.
Right.
But what does she do? She takes a Hebrew infant and she adopts it and raises it as her own child, right? I mean, I think that's a pretty remarkable thing that she did, and maybe it has something to do with the man that Moses became, right? So I want to credit both of his mothers for, raising him in a way that led him to be, this great prophet and deliverer of the people. There's a few others, but that's just sort of a few other Old Testament mothers are mentioned there, but that's a taste of it, I think.
Yeah, no, I love that. The Book of Revelation is in a lot of ways the most challenging one, because apocalyptic imagery is very difficult for modern people to understand, and because it it can be kind of offensive from a certain modernist perspective, right? If you read the Book of Revelation without any sort of context, it's pretty easy to take what the writer of Revelation says and draw some pretty terrible conclusions about it. But obviously, we have to contextualize it in its first century context. So I want you to walk us through this kind of last Bible question I'm going to ask you. How does the Book of Revelation portray mothers for good or for bad? And how should modern Christians think about the way that mothers are portrayed in the Book of Revelation?
Yeah, this is a challenging one. In the book, I took the lens of what we call the virgin whore dichotomy. I took that sort of as my lens through which to read and interpret the female figures of Revelation, because they are primarily figures or images, right? Not real women. And so I think this idea of the virgin whore dichotomy is helpful, because it does help us contextualize, as you said, maybe why they're portrayed in the way that they are. For those not familiar, this is basically just the idea that in patriarchal culture, there is a tendency to portray women in just one of two ways, either being the sort of pure, virtuous type of figure, or this sort of whore figure. So it's called the virgin whore dichotomy, but really you don't have to be literally a virgin or literally a whore to be on either side. It's just that's sort of the two extremes. And then even women who are not virgins or not whores, are sort of associated with one side or the other. We can think of maybe older entertainment that has, the damsel in distress or the femme fatale, right? Fortunately, in more recent years, we've seen entertainment that fleshes out the full humanity of women a little bit more, than in the past. But that's kind of like the idea of women that is at play here. So we have, and then actually, so it's a dichotomy, but at the same time, one thing I argue in the book is that really, actually, there's one third way to be as a woman in the ancient world, and that is to be a mother, right? So you can be a virgin, a whore, or if you want to kind of get out of that system, the only way out is to be a mother. And so there's three major female symbolic figures in the book of Revelation. One of them is a virgin, one of them is a whore, and one of them is a mother. So my argument basically was that this is not in any way a coincidence, right? That this is the three female figures that we have in Revelation. So the mother first this is the woman clothed with the sun in Revelation 12. She is often associated with Mary because she gives birth to the Messiah, but she's highly symbolic, right? Even if we are to understand she's Mary, it's not a literal representation of Mary. It's Mary as sort of a heavenly figure, and so. This, I think, again, I've talked about identity before. I think this is also something that is intended to be identity shaping for the readers, because she gives birth to this male child, but also she is portrayed as being the mother of all those on earth who are faithful to God. So I think the readers are intended to identify themselves with being the children of this mother. So then we have the whore of Babylon in chapter 17 and 18. So she represents sort of everything evil and depraved. She represents the city of Rome, really, but also everything evil, everything depraved, idolatry, the oppression of the poor, the persecution of Christians, all of that. And she has a rather graphic downfall, which in the book I tie that to some disturbing portions of the Old Testament prophets and the way that they treat female figures there. So that's something that we could talk about for an hour. Obviously, we can't do that do that right now. But then just very quickly, the third one is the virgin. This is the bride, right at the very end, who represents the new Jerusalem. We could also say she represents the church, right? This new community of God that comes at the end of the story. So, and then there's Jezebel. I think probably we don't have time to talk about Jezebel, but Jezebel is sort of the only real woman that appears in one of the letters at the beginning of the book, but she is sort of similarly pigeonholed into this whore category as well, with some graphic and disturbing imagery about her punishment, her being thrown on a bed, and the killing of her children and things like that. So she kind of participates in these same things. So I think in terms of what are we supposed to do with all of this, I think we ought to wrestle with these texts as readers. But that doesn't mean rejecting Revelation altogether. I'm firmly in the camp that we neither need to reject biblical texts nor accept them uncritically. There is another way. There's another path besides those two extremes, and I wish that people would take that path more often. I think the task for us is to figure out how to receive the message of Revelation, which really is a promise of a world where oppression ceases, right? And yet oppression can be perpetuated by certain readings of these graphic and disturbing images related to violence against women in the book. So how do we receive the message of Revelation without reinscribing these patriarchal themes? I don't have a perfect answer to that, but it's something that we just have to continually wrestle with in conversation with one another.
Yeah, well, that leads me perfectly to my second to last question, and I want to kind of talk about the impact of your work. And the first one is it just has to do with, in general, how Christians should be more attentive to the role of motherhood in the New Testament. And I know, like for me, my daughter's 10 years old, so seeing my wife be a mother and develop as a mother, and just having an adult relationship with my own mom, and I work with a lot of women who are great moms as well. And so, like, the older I get, the more I appreciate motherhood and all of the work and sacrifice that goes into that. And it's one of those things too, like we were talking about earlier, like in church, we love to talk about justification and salvation and all of that kind of stuff. But when it comes to like these practical these practical issues like motherhood, we almost never talk about this. So how should modern Christians think about motherhood, and in what ways can we kind of reclaim I think the God-given significance of that responsibility that he's given to women?
Yeah, I mean, I think paying attention to motherhood is part of a larger project of paying attention to women in the Bible. It sort of participates in that
Yeah.
broader project. Many people may grow up in church hearing, only about Abraham and David and Moses, and in the Old Testament, and Jesus, Peter, and Paul in the New Testament, and hardly even be aware that there are women there as well. Um, so, but even beyond just sort of like highlighting the presence of women in general and mothers in particular in the text, I think it's also important. Like what I was trying to do in the book is to not just show that they're there, that they're present, but actually that motherhood is sort of related to the way that the New Testament expresses the heart of the gospel, right? So it's not peripheral, but is actually one of the ways that the New Testament authors express the message that they're trying to express about Jesus and about God. So, God is not just like a father, even though that's mostly what we focus on. God is also like a mother, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? God has associated with motherhood in both testaments. We've talked about the idea of Jesus birthing the church from the cross. Jesus's side is pierced in the Gospel of John, and blood and water come out. I think that's the fluids of birth are coming out of his abdomen,
Yeah.
as he is there on the cross. And so that's just another detail that sort of folds into this idea of birth related to the cross. Um, we didn't talk about it today, but Jesus calls himself a mother hen, right? Compares
Yeah.
himself to a mother hen. And there is ways that wisdom, the figure of wisdom, Sophia, is personified in the Old Testament as a female figure, and Jesus is associated with wisdom, specifically even with the personification of wisdom as a female figure in the Gospels. So this is central. This is important. This is not peripheral to who Jesus is for us. And then even you think about something like, what should church leaders be like? Well, according to Paul, they should be like nursing mothers.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're in labor, they're experiencing birth pangs.
Right.
I think that was when I forgot to mention earlier that Paul describes himself as being physically in labor with the Galatians. So these are the images for church leadership within the New Testament. So all of that is just to say, I think it's really important. It's not just a little decoration of the text, an interesting image, but really relates to the heart of the message.
Yeah. And the final question I want to ask you is the impact that you want this book to have on New Testament scholarship generally. Like I read a lot of works on biblical scholarship, and a lot of the times they kind of hinge on the same old issues. And so I like tonight I'm probably going to finish it up. I've been reading Paul Novinson's Paul and Judaism at the End of History, which is an incredible book, and there's a lot of really like amazing proposals put forward about Paul and the law and ethnicity and eschatology and all of that stuff. It's great, but this is kind of like the heart of a lot of debate in biblical scholarship. Whereas, as I was reading through your book, like this is something that it's been relegated to the periphery, but I don't think it should be. And I do actually think that it has the potential to inject new life in old debates in ways that people might not have anticipated. So as you think about your work in relationship to other biblical scholarship, what kind of impact do you want it to have on the discipline? And how should New Testament scholars try to incorporate some of your insights going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, biblical scholarship has been around for a very long time, as long
Yes.
as the Bible has been around, right? So kind of what you're saying is that we do tend to go around and around on the same issues. To stay employed, we have to keep finding
Right.
new things
Yes.
to say
Right.
about the same conversations that we've been having for years and years. But I think part of the way that biblical scholars continue to find new things to say, even after centuries and centuries of work, is because the people who are doing the reading in the academy have changed, right? I think, it's been quite a revolution in the last I don't know, 40, 50 years or so, to have women scholars beginning to participate. Of course, women have always been readers and interpreters of the Bible, but previously largely excluded from official academic and ecclesial positions, to have a real impact on the guild in that way. But that's what we begin to see happening, right? So I think, I haven't mentioned this up to now, but I'm a mother myself, which is not an accident, that I decided to write a book about motherhood. I didn't say that when you asked me at the beginning, why did you write this book? I didn't say because I am a mother, but that is one of the reasons, right? That's one of the reasons I'm interested in this topic. So if you never have a mother who is an academic biblical scholar, you're not going to end up hearing about motherhood in the Bible. But when you do, suddenly you find out, oh, there's all this here that people weren't paying attention to. So I think that's the kind of impact on the guild that I hope it has, just opening up new ideas about different ways to read these texts based on who's doing the reading. And I think, this book covers the entire New Testament. So I guess to be more specific about what impact I hope it would have, I hope it would have the impact of making people intrigued about what's there. And then, they might zero in on a more specific place and dig deeper, because I was covering the entire New Testament. So many things I just cover in a page or two that could easily be their own study. Any one of the mothers of Revelation that we were just talking about, for example, could be an extensive study on their own. So I guess I would hope that people would read my book and then also think about, well, where's the point where I might really dig in and find out more about what's going on in that particular spot with motherhood.
Well, Dr. Jennifer McNeel, we have covered a lot of ground in the last hour. I really appreciate the book. Again, it's called Under Her Wings, Mothers and Motherhood in the New Testament. It's out now, or at least I guess it will be when it comes. I actually don't really know when the book comes out. It'll be sometime soon. You can pre-order it, I know, on Amazon. So go and get a copy of the book is what I'm trying to say. It's fantastic, a really underrated issue in the New Testament. So I couldn't recommend it more to my audience. Before I let you go, for listeners that want to find your other work, where can they go to find you?
Mm-hmm. The book is out, by the way. So if people want to
perfect.
purchase it immediately, they can, as on Amazon or, Barnes and Noble or wherever you buy your books online, or directly from Eerdmans. Also, this is my second full-length book. The first one was a revision of my doctoral dissertation. So I joked earlier that there's not many people in the world that want to read 200 pages on one verse of the New Testament. But if anybody listening is one of those people, you can also get my previous book that is a thorough exploration of the idea of Paul as nursing mother to the Thessalonians. Beyond that, I do have a website. It's mostly inactive at the moment, but you can still go on there and read about things I wrote before. I did make a lot of posts on that website at one time about about women, not specifically mothers, but just about women in Paul's letters especially, but some in the Gospels as well. So if people are just interested in reading some more general writings from me about women in the New Testament, you can check that out. It's called thetextincontext.com. thetextincontext.com. So again, I don't promise many new posts are forthcoming, but you can still read what's already there.
Perfect. Well, Dr. McNeel, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great.